Araki may have solved one of JoJo's biggest problems. And no, I'm not talking about fights or pacing. With the introduction of JoJolands and its main character, Jodio, Araki may have finally solved his big problem of boring protagonists. And there's more than a few reasons why Jodio has already convinced me that A, he might be JoJo's best protagonist, and B, Part 9 may very well be the best part in all of JoJo. Now, naturally, you might be wondering what I'm smoking when I say that JoJo has boring protagonists. So let me explain what I mean and how this ties into Part 9 before you start spamming that dislike button. In each part of JoJo's bizarre adventure, the main character is either the most brilliant, the most beautifully written, the most generational protagonist in all of fiction, or they're completely forgettable. And this has been a problem ever since Part 1. I don't know how many times I've talked to people who were like, yeah, Part 1's okay, but I don't like Jonathan. I mean, let's be honest, we all know who the real star of Part 1 really is. So then you get Part 2, and it's like night and day. Suddenly people are like, yeah, Joseph is such a good protagonist, he's so much better than Jonathan. I also think Part 2 is slightly overrated, but we'll talk about that in another video. So of course then we get Parts 3 and 4, and nobody debates how popular those guys are. Say what you will about Jotaro, but he's one of the most iconic characters in manga. And regardless of your thoughts on Part 4, everyone loves the vibes of Josuke. In fact, Josuke could very well be the poster boy for vibing. That's kinda his whole thing. So then we get to Part 5, and while people like him now, during the anime run, Giorno was largely considered one of the most boring protagonists since Jonathan. Then we get to Part 6, and disregarding the fact that Stone Ocean is already a mixed bag, Jolene is just sort of okay. Compared to the last 3 characters, she's just sort of alright. Either you love her, or you're like, yeah, she's cool. Then, of course, there's Johnny Joestar in Steel Ball Run, arguably the best part of JoJo and the best written Joestar. Then there's Part 8, which I wasn't around for while it was running, but I'm not that crazy about Josuke, and as far as I can tell, he's not really everyone's favorite. Which brings us back to Part 9 and why I loved Jodio so much. Especially after just finishing JoJolion, getting into JoJolands, it really felt like night and day. With Josuke, I was like, I get what Araki is going for, but I'm not loving it. And then I met Jodio, and I instantly fell in love. So naturally, the question that comes up is, how can the same author write one protagonist that's a snooze fest, and another one that's got me hyping the shit out of a story that's only 17 chapters long? The answer lies in the 3 approaches to protagonists in JoJo. But before I say anything else, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, with each Joestar, there's an issue of balancing 3 things: desire, virtue, and design. JoJo is largely a story about fate, and so with each part you see the respective Joestar grapple with fate in one way or another. And to do that you need some kind of compelling desire, some kind of motivation. The more resolve they have, the more strong-willed they are, the more interesting they tend to be. But you also have to keep this in check. Because if the character becomes too greedy, then they're not likable as the main character. It's the reason why Jonathan is the main character and Dio is the villain. Finally, in addition to balancing desire and virtue, Araki also needs to consider the intricacies of each new character's design. So for example, after Jonathan, Araki decided he wanted to make characters that weren't as by the books, so to speak. With Giorno, Araki had to make a character that was equal parts Dio and Jonathan. With JoJolion, he needed to make a compelling character while also writing a character with amnesia who was practically an open book. So more often than not, when we get a character that people don't love, it's because they fail one of these 3 things. And it's because of these 3 things that I'm absolutely in love with Jodio. So you look at desire, right? In other words, how self-centered Jodio is. Well, right off the bat, we learn that he's a gangster and he wants to become stupid rich. I mean, that's a whole lot of motivation. And on top of that, we learn that when he was younger, Jodio was told that he has pretty much all the signs of a textbook psychopath. In other words, a person who lacks empathy for others and is overwhelmingly motivated by their own personal gain. You can't really get more self-centered than that. So in the desire and motivation department, Jodio is easily more self-motivated than any of the other Joestars. Now the beauty of this is how Araki balances Jodio's ambition. Because like I said before, you take all of these qualities out of context and you essentially have Dio 2.0. That's why Dio is such a good villain. So when making Giorno, Araki gave him the ambition of Dio but the virtue of Jonathan. And that's what he's done with Jodio as well. Jodio is a criminal who doesn't mind killing cops, but he's also a loving son who regularly checks in on his mother over the phone. He's motivated by money and rising up in the criminal world, but he also goes out of his way to protect his friends, especially his older brother who he loves very much and shares an unbreakable bond with. So while Jodio has many flaws and antisocial qualities, he also has plenty of redeemable qualities. And it's this careful balance that makes Jodio such a compelling protagonist. And finally, Jodio, like all of the other great Joestars, has a great design. If you haven't figured it out by now, Jodio is supposed to be a new take on Giorno. Giorno was the son of Dio and wanted to be a gangster. Jodio wants to make a boatload of money in the underworld, and while we don't know how the two were connected, the dude's literally got Dio in his name. And for all the reasons we've already discussed, I think we can agree Jodio is a more interesting take on Giorno. Maybe his design isn't as flashy as Giorno's, but his design is still awesome with his crazy haircut and cool outfit. And I think Jodio's dynamic of being a psychopath while also being a reliable friend and brother make him a character that's much easier to invest in than someone like Giorno who, while he is a compelling protagonist, doesn't immediately stand out compared to the other characters in Bucciarati's team. And it's for these same reasons that I think JoJolands is on track to be the best part in all of JoJo's. Because when you start JoJolands, Araki doesn't immediately open to Jodio. He doesn't start by setting the stage that is Hawaii. The very first thing we see is the following: powers that have forms and shapes but are invisible. They are called stands. They exist all over and always have, but they are simply unseen by those that do not try to see them. From here, the very next thing we see is Araki explaining that this will be the story of how Jodio will become filthy rich. So, he creates context by talking about stands, and then sets the tone for the story by introducing Jodio's motivation. Now, there's one of two ways to look at this. Option 1, you can view this as Araki simply highlighting stands because it's likely the last part and this is JoJo. Or Option 2, you can view it as Araki suggesting that Jodio's story will heavily tie into the very nature of stands themselves. And what are stands if not the manifestation of a character's ambitions? And funny enough, Jodio just so happens to be arguably the most ambitious of all the Joestars. So part of the reason why I'm so invested in Jodio and Part 9 is because I'm already convinced that Jodio's story arc will be one of the most important in all of JoJo, and for a few reasons. First of all, like I mentioned before, JoJo is a story about fate and how each character deals with fate. And since we have what seems to be the most ambitious of the Joestars, I have a slight suspicion that Jodio's story will be the most epic take on this recurring dynamic. Another reason I'm so invested in Part 9 is because of Jodio and stands and what it means to have a stand. If JoJo is about fate and how you carve your own path, and stands are manifestations of your ambitions, then who better to represent the core of JoJo than a character who has already been shown to be one of the most ambitious characters in the entire story. So for these two reasons, I'm mainly invested in JoJolands because I think it's going to be a sort of grand take on what JoJo is really all about. Finally, one last reason I like Jodio and JoJolands so much is because of the mystery surrounding Jodio and what connections he might have to Dio. Because like I said before, we don't know if he's actually related to Dio, but he does literally have Dio's name. Plus, as Part 9 is largely a new spin on Part 5, the implication is that Jodio is somehow supposed to be a new take on Giorno, just like Johnny was a new take on Jonathan, and Josuke was also a new take on previous characters. And it's more than just, oh well, everyone likes Dio, so we want more Dio. It's more the fact that in this sort of renaissance of JoJo's that started with Part 7, Dio has been a relatively unimportant character compared to earlier parts. Obviously, he played a big part in Steel Ball Run as the character we knew as Diego Brando, but then in JoJoleon there was zero mention of Dio or Diego. So now that we're in JoJolands, a story that is implied to be a new take on Part 5 in Giorno, and we have a character named Jodio, I'm excited to see how Araki will inevitably tie Dio back into the story, especially considering it's already building up to be Araki's most ambitious part so far. Now, could I be totally wrong and the only reference to Dio we get is him being part of Jodio's name? But because this already feels so similar to Part 5, and because Jodio literally has Dio in his name, there's too much on the table for there not to be some kind of connection to Dio. Which is why a large part of why I can't wait for new chapters is because I want to see how Araki handles this. But as we've discussed, the other big reason I like JoJoland so much is because of Jodio's unique position as a protagonist. He has all the virtue of Giorno, all the ruthless ego of Dio, and on top of that, he's just a cool character. His stand November Rain may not go punchy, but it has a lot of potential and also just looks really cool. And Jodio has already proven to be a cunning, ruthless, yet caring main character. It's for all of these reasons and more that I think Jodio might end up as JoJo's best main character. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you rate Jodio so far? How are you liking JoJolands? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another video like this one, then check out my discussion of what happened to JoJo's. In that video, I discuss the current state of the JoJo anime and manga. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.